Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Chapter 1. The Overview. The land of the Blacks was a vast land, a big world into itself covering 12 million square miles. From its northernmost point in what is now Tunisia to Cape Achilles is approximately 5,000 miles, and in its widest extent from east to west is 4,600 miles. The whole of this second largest continent was once Bilad as-Sudan, the land of the Blacks, and not just the southern region to which they had been steadily pushed from the north. After Asian, Greek, and Roman occupations, the term Sudan came to indicate the areas not yet taken from the Blacks and was coextensive with the Ethiopian Empire. For the Ethiopian Empire once extended from the Mediterranean north and southward to the source of the Nile in the country, Abyssinia, which recently reverted to the ancient name of the Ethiopian Empire of which in earlier times it formed its southeastern provinces. Even as late as the times of Menes, 3100 BC, Ethiopia still included 3/4 of Egypt, or up to 29 degrees north parallel. The Asians held the Delta region, hence the two lands, well known to all historians but never fully explained. To explain the two lands, of course, would blast the myth about the builders of Egyptian civilization. It was pointed out that the study of the Blacks must begin in Egypt because more of their indestructible monuments are there, and, further, because many of the artifacts archaeologists have been uncovering during the past 75 years as Egyptian are in fact African. Yet the very heartland of the race and the cradle of civilization were actually further southward below the First Cataract, centered around the capital cities of Napata and Meroe. From there, Black civilization spread northward, reaching its most spectacular achievements in what became known as Egyptian civilization. The general condition of vast stretches of land over the continent, uninhabited and uninhabitable, seemed to support the Western thesis that Africans never developed any worthwhile civilization, had no notable historic past, and, the more charitable might add, that in the very nature of their situation it could not be otherwise. Samuel Baker went far in promoting the idea of African innate inferiority, even if he had to use the most forbidding area in Africa to do it, the terrible swamplands of the Sud, an area south of Khartoum that in its full extent is as big as England. No one would claim that any kind of society, civilized or savage, could exist in the Sud swamplands, probably the largest in the world. For it was neither land nor water, but a seemingly endless mass of rotting vegetation, interwoven tree-like vines, steaming heat, swarming man-killing mosquitoes, crocodiles, hippos, and other unknown forms of tropical life. The conclusion of Baker and others was that they were in a land where time had stood still since its beginning, where life never advanced and the human species has simply rotated in aimless cycles like the animal life in the Sud. As late as the 1840s and 50s, these explorers, even the most ignorant, should have known that in the same vast continent of wastelands, tropical rainforests, and swamplands, there were also areas of arable land and civilized states. But they wrote about what they saw the most of, vast stretches of wasteland and secluded groups of strange people. But as we shall see, some of the great kingdoms and empire builders in Africa seem not to have known the meaning of failure or had any ideas about surrendering to fate. Ejected here, they led the people there and began to build again. Wherever the splintered-off refugee groups found a place where the soil seemed favorable for cultivation and the land unoccupied by preceding immigrants, they settled and began to build villages again. A sense of relative security was a necessary factor in deciding to begin a new settlement. A crucial question was, how many miles had they put between the slave hunters and themselves? For the kind of houses and community buildings they would erect depended directly on the probability of permanent settlement or sudden flight again. In short, whether to build large, sturdy, and attractive compound homes and temples of worship or easily demolished huts. It was for reasons of security that so many of these groups, later called tribes or societies, sought the most hidden and isolated areas they could find. This permanent separation from their kinsmen in other groups was generally quite contrary to their heart's desires. The original splintering off and parting was often in tears. But breaking up into smaller units seemed to be the only route for survival in a permanent crisis situation, apparently permanent since the movement of people over the continent had been going on so far beyond the memory of each generation that migrations and temporary settlements were among the most significant facts in the oral tradition of each society. Fragmentation and isolation had two momentous consequences. The first was that the isolation of various groups led to the development of over 2,000 different dialects and languages. The second fateful outcome was that the rise of all these tongues widened the gulf between the blacks that territorial distances had already achieved. One should pause here for reflection if there is any serious attempt to really understand what happened to the African people and why. For even without the aid of Western writers in emphasizing the language differences and the cultural variations and attempting to show how unrelated the blacks are, they themselves came, in time, to consider themselves unique and each society not only independent of the other, but its enemy, if only potentially. Disunity and mutual suspicion became an African way of life. Small chiefdoms sprang up everywhere, often no more than a single village of 100 or 200 people. Africa, therefore, presented itself to Asia and Europe as the ideal land for exploitation, enslavement, and conquest. The history is complex and many-sided, and would be so if we were discussing just one nation and not an entire continent. This is why our focus must be on the main lines of development, the African-wide aspects, and the unmistakable common origin and continent-wide sameness of basic institutions which these universal aspects reflect. There were then different outcomes for different societies. Some perished even to the last member from disease, starvation, or warfare. Others, despairing of ever again being able to have a fixed abode, became nomads. Some, although isolated so long that they had developed different languages and customs, had nevertheless decided that salvation required a union with other groups. These were the tribes that merged with other tribes, lost their separate identity and languages, and who evolved from this process a single common language, larger and large chiefdoms, kingdoms, and finally empires that began the rebirth of their long-lost civilization. The fiercest wars between the blacks occurred in the founding and expansion of new kingdoms and empires. For while the core groups were voluntary confederations, expansion of empire required the conquest of neighboring states, usually small, independent chiefdoms that preferred to maintain their absolute sovereignty. The repercussions of this forced unity by conquests were to shake the continent from end to end centuries later when European political rule ended. Modern Africans and students of Africa have tended to emphasize the destructive impact of European imperialism in Africa while ignoring the most damaging developments from the Arab impact before the general European takeover in the last quarter of the 19th century, a relatively recent period. This point is important, for one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the blacks is that dealing with those dauntless leaders and people who, having lost one state after another along with 3/4 of their kinsmen, nevertheless overrode all the forces of destruction and death and began to build, always once again, still another state. From the earliest times, the elimination of these states as independent African sovereignties had been an Asian objective, stepped up by Muslim onslaughts after the 7th century AD. So the re-established black states were still being conquered and Islamized when Europeans began to arrive in greater numbers to impose their rule over both Asians and Africans. The big thing that happened here, to repeat, is generally glossed over, ignored, or forgotten, the last being a pretension, since a historical development of this magnitude could hardly be forgotten by serious writers on Africa. For what happened very simply was that European imperialism in Africa checked and replaced Arab imperialism. The Arab screams against Western imperialism are the screams of outrage against Western Caucasians for checking and subduing Eastern Caucasians in the very midst of the blacks they had conquered. There are still countless of blacks who are naive enough to believe that the Arabs' bitter attack on Western colonialism show their common cause with Black Africa. Insofar as those who were fortunate enough to find promising areas for settlement are concerned, the picture was generally one of state building and the revival of basic African institutions which, though not forgotten, could neither be maintained nor developed by any people forever on the move. But what about the countless societies, fleeing before the conquering hordes and the enslavers, as well as the famine and deaths which were its daily companion? What about those who found no promised land anywhere? For quite unlike the societies I mentioned that could settle down and had the opportunity to start and develop civilizations comparable to any elsewhere in the world at the time, these people could neither settle down nor, therefore, develop a civilization. What they suffered from year to year as they wandered over the continent is almost beyond both description and belief. In fact, while the story is well known, few writers would want to go into its awful details. Suffice to say at this point that here now were numerous societies of Africans that were virtually sentenced either to death from starvation or enslavement by Arabs, and I am still in the pre-European period, or barbarism and savagery, and in many cases even cannibalism. Under such conditions, I would defend not only the retrogression of these people to barbarism, but to cannibalism itself. The defense of the latter is easy, since it has been well established that other supposedly highly civilized men will revert to savagery and cannibalism under prolonged conditions of extreme hunger and thirst, when survival itself is the only question that dominates the hunger-crazed mind. This phenomenon of reverting to a state of savagery and even cannibalism under extreme conditions of starvation is known to occur universally among various peoples, white, black, brown, red, or yellow. The facts we have, then, show that after they lost Egypt and the eastern Sudan, some Africans, overriding all adverse conditions, grouped themselves to form nations and developed a high order of civilization independent of any external influences. Others never settled anywhere long enough to develop anything notable, but seemed to remain in a state of lethargy or suspended animation. They had surrendered to fate and became too weak to fight back. They descended to a state of semi-barbarism. Descended because most of these societies had known better times and a higher order of life. Some, in more favorable circumstances, nevertheless failed to advance. Still, others were in the class discussed in connection with cannibalism, hunger-crazed people who had sunk to the lowest levels of dog-eat-dog existence. These last are the people about whom European and American authors delight to write. No cartoons are better than those showing a sweating white man, usually an explorer or missionary, being cooked in a huge black pot, while black savages dance around with human bones decorating their heads or stuck through pierced noses. The idea these experts on Africa have been planting in the minds of the peoples of the world, and are still actively planting, is that this is Africa, and these are the savages who are now clamoring for independence. Nature joins the attack. The question of physiography, vegetation, climate, water, and soil are all more crucial in the history of blacks than they are in the case of any other people. For here, a whole continent is involved, and on that continent, a people who in one period of time were among the foremost people on Earth, and in a later period the farthest behind. Nature itself set an environmental stage in a manner and under conditions which appear to have been designed to test to the utmost one race's moral, intellectual, and physical powers to override all obstacles to survival. The slow but relentlessly steady withdrawal of inhabitable land over the centuries eventually left Africa a land of desolation, a wasteland, the greater part of which was desert and treeless grassland with only a fractional part, about 10%, with the much-needed forests and thickets. Even the continental land configuration was against its native inhabitants. Like a vast inclined plain, the highlands, beginning in Central Africa at 3,000 feet above sea level, rose southward to higher and higher levels, reaching the highest level of 15,000 feet in the southeastern provinces of the ancient Ethiopian Empire. This caused Africa to slope northward, and its principal rivers, the Nile in particular, to flow in the same directions. This single circumstance caused the blacks to lose the very earliest centers of their civilization and the heartland of the race. Egypt and the southern area that was later called the Sudan, or Land of the Blacks, just as though Egypt itself was not also formerly the Land of the Blacks. For the greatest of the rivers, the Nile, played still another tragic joke on its people. The river, the longest in the world, flows 4,127 miles across Africa from Lake Nyanza to the Mediterranean. Yet not until it reaches Aswan and begins its last stretch of 750 miles to the sea does it overflow to further enrich 13,500 square miles of already fertile soil in Egypt. For its 3,377 miles through the heart of Black Africa, the Nile sank as it cut deep canyons in its soft limestone floor, leaving cliffs at places from a few hundred to a few thousand feet high. What this means is that for over 3,000 miles through the eastern side of the continent, the Nile was collecting the rich soil carried to it by heavy rains and 1,000 tributary streams. These flow into the mother of rivers and add to the enrichment of its waters flowing northward, guarded all the way by her deep channels until it reaches the hard sandstone bottom above Aswan and then begins its periodic overflow the rest of the way to the sea. Here, a natural phenomenon cheated the Africans in a big way that was to have dire consequences. "There could be no black daughter of the Nile," observed Parsons in his Streams of History. For the Nile, in making Upper Ethiopia, Egypt, so rich in food production that it became world famous not only as the breadbasket of the world, but also for its highly advanced civilization, stirred the envy of Asia and Europe, from which continents migrants began to settle. Even in this, the physical geography of Africa was favorable to the peaceful settlers who were later to become its conquerors and rulers, for the seacoast is lowland everywhere, not more than 500 feet above sea level, and remains lowland 500 miles inland. Asian and European occupation of the seacoasts of North Africa and East Africa was therefore relatively easy, and probably even welcomed at first by the blacks as co-partners in world trade. But the poor and hungry nomads from the vast desert areas of the Middle East poured into the most fertile and easily accessible areas of this other land of deserts that is North Africa. There were several consequences of the greatest historical importance, which are generally not sufficiently stressed. The first was that both the Saharan transformation and the steady incursion of Asians pressured more and more blacks back into the interior to concentrate in the already limited survival areas where just to subsist was a daily struggle. The second important result was the widespread amalgamation of the races. For the weaker, more submissive blacks remained in Asian-occupied territory to become slave laborers and slave soldiers and to witness a ruthless sexual traffic in black women that gave rise to a new breed of Afro-Asians. These were classified as Caucasians or Asians. They themselves bitterly objected to being identified with the race of their mothers, African, when these later became known as Egyptians in Egypt, Moors in Morocco, and Mauritanians or Carthaginians in Carthage, Tunis. Great care was taken to distinguish them from Africans in daily intercourse, in paintings, and in documentary literature. This new breed, half African, was to join with their Asian fathers and forefathers in the wars and enslaving raids against the blacks that went on century after century until all North Africa was eventually taken. Still another fateful geographical factor that favored the invaders has been implied or partly stated in the foregoing observations. Aside from the easy occupation of the lowlands of the seacoast and the gradual taking over of the rich lands of the Nile Valley and its ancient civilization, both Asians and Europeans found the highlands of southern and eastern Africa more pleasant and healthy for Caucasian settlement. This meant that even after nature had damned 3/4 of the continent's landmass as impossible to support human life, the Asians and Europeans came in to seize and hold the best of the 1/4 that was left. The blacks found themselves cut off from all seacoasts that then mattered, hemmed in from all directions and confined within narrower and narrower limits. Thus they became a wandering people, forever migrating in their own vast homeland, fragmenting from great united nations into countless little splinter societies, becoming so isolated from each other that each formed a new language of its own, considered itself quite different from its original brothers, now regarded as strangers and enemies in the endless tribal wars that ensued over inhabitable land. The land over which these struggles went on varied in different regions. So did the climate that greatly affected it. The people and even some of their institutions varied under environmental influences. The landmass in the eastern regions, for example, has been undergoing a vertical movement of elevation and sinking along with a leveling process occasioned by the atmosphere and weathering since Miocene times. Geologists trace the elevation of the mountains in the area, even Kilimanjaro, and the faulting and fracturing that created the Great Rift to early volcanic activity. In the arid and semi-arid regions, there are vast stretches of desolate land which were not made so by nature alone. For, like the Sahara itself, much of it was once woodland where animal life flourished and streams flowed. Man played the leading role in its destruction by fire in his shifting farm methods. Animals helped in the process. The relation of green grass and forest to climate and climate to rainfall seems not to have been known or fully appreciated. In treeless and grassless areas, the periodic rains evaporate into non-water-holding earth. One may travel hundreds of miles over regions of this kind without finding a single stream. All rivers and streams have disappeared like the raindrops in the sand. Because of the same physical characteristics of the land previously discussed, irrigation was extremely difficult and in most places impossible outside of Egypt. We have spoken so much about African deserts of sand and rocks that one might be misled by thinking that it was this kind of land alone that could not support a population. But there were vast, non-desert areas of hard red and red-brown soil that had been leached by heavy rainfall, robbed of its essential elements for vegetation, such as calcium and phosphorus, and, of course, its once rich humus of topsoil. This continuous weathering was obviously destructive. The soil problem was further aggravated by having underneath floors of hard laterite elements, just as though there was a master plan to guarantee that this soil would not hold any water. Therefore, the problem involved far more than restoring topsoil and a land conservation program to prevent erosion, because this hard floor underneath drains away the rainfall as fast as it reached that level. No corner or scrap of land in Africa has escaped hunger, says Josu de Castro in his Geography of Hunger. This is a continent of the starving, all of it, and in hunger and chronic malnutrition may be found one of the most decisive reasons for the backwardness of Africa, for the relative stagnation and lassitude of the greater part of its people. But the Garden of Eden areas must not be overlooked when we are considering the general, overall conditions. These are areas which, while not comparable to the rich food plains of the Nile Valley and Delta, have unfertilized soil that nevertheless produce a surprisingly rapid growth of abundant vegetation and a heavy concentration of animal and bird life. These are the areas where fruit and nuts of many varieties grow in abundance without the aid of man. Without these areas of salvation here and there over the continent, along with pastoral grazing land, the blacks as a race would have doubtlessly perished from the earth. They almost did. The trend once seemed to be definitely in the direction of extinction. Even if we dismiss accounts of planned mass extermination by their enemies as unreliable, too many other threats to survival remained to darken every ray of hope. Disease was everywhere, the offspring of distress, privation, hunger, and malnutrition. It spread over the land as advanced scouts for death. Over half of Africa's babies were either born dead or died soon after birth. Old age was between 40 and 50 years. 3/4 of the people, even today in our own time, are still weakened by malnutrition and malarial water, and a number of diseases that are largely traceable to these two causes: beriberi, pellagra, scurvy, and even leprosy. The scourge of childhood is kwashiorkor, or malignant malnutrition. This accelerated depopulation of the black man's countries resulting from the nature of soil and climate, mass enslavement, deaths in resisting slavery, wars of conquest, intertribal conflicts, exhaustions from endless flights and migrations, and ever-present disease. All this reduced the black population by 3/4. Under reasonable, favorable conditions, the African population today would be 4 times its present number. And when it is pointed out that 3/4 of the people today are still weakened by malaria and malnutrition, reference is made to the 1/4 of the people who survived in spite of it all. How, then, were the blacks able to battle invading enemies from one end of the continent to the other for several thousand years? True, they were overcome in the end, but what sustained them through all those centuries of struggle on so many different fronts and against so many different kinds of enemies? Weakened so generally by both disease and what became perpetual hunger, whence came their strength and courage to carry on? It may well be that the answers lie in the death-defying pyramids they built in Egypt when the land was theirs. There must be a number of preconditions without which the genius of any people for thinking, inventing, discovering, and building will be inhibited and may even die under extreme circumstances. Preconditions for progress. A few of these preconditions for progress are: 1. The people must become famine-free and be able to end their perennial roaming from place to place in search of food and water and settle down. 2. Having found suitable territory, the leaders must proceed, through negotiations with other neighboring societies and fragmented groups, to nation building. 3. There must be developed, and this is a crucial precondition, a sense of national community among the various language groups that make up the country. This is so important that it cannot be left to wishful thinking or chance. It must be programmed in such a way that a sense of loyalty and being an important part of a great united brotherhood, which is the nation itself, will develop naturally. 4. A strong army for defense. 5. The reign of law and justice, applying equally to all classes in the society. The people must feel absolutely secure as individuals, and that in their country there is equal justice for all. In short, certain conditions in a country can bring about that internal peace, stability, and confidence which unshackle the mind. Now there is time to think. No more trekking with bleeding feet for hundreds of miles across rocky deserts. No more seeing your kinsmen fall out and welcome death along the way. A home at last, better farms, plenty of food, and now, time to think. There is nothing mystical about the reasons why one group of people can easily become physically and mentally strong, while another becomes physically weak and less mentally alert. An abundance of nutritious food and pure drinking water may spell the difference between advance and decay. The number of death-dealing diseases developing from malnutrition alone is alarming, but what must be stressed above everything else is that millions of babies may become both physically and mentally retarded by disease while in their mother's wombs, which is another way of saying that a people wholly ignorant or indifferent to basic health can themselves become inferior in fact. But even this central fact, when fully realized, will still remain in the field of mere discussion until blacks everywhere begin mass organizations for mass education of the masses. The system is so structured, worldwide, that blacks are forced into conditions that can lead to inferiority even genetically. There must be a breakthrough or gradual extinction. This is the final precondition for survival and advancement. Your attention is called again to the map of Africa, for it is very significant where the earliest invaders entered and permanently settled. They took over the areas of trade and easy contacts with their homeland and the other nations of the world. A point that simply cannot be overstressed in considering the plight of the African people. In the north, they settled around the Mediterranean, thereby maintaining contact with Europe and Asia. In the northeast, east, and south, they settled along the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, thereby keeping in touch with their homeland and the trade with countries further away. Black Africa was thus hemmed in and effectively cut off commercially and otherwise from the rest of the world. The techniques of penetration and dominance were varied. Some came as peaceful traders and, doubtless, trade was all that was intended by many. Africans were always eager traders. The main attraction of foreign traders was that they brought in many new kinds of commodities. These traders had little or no trouble in gaining coastal footholds as trading posts. The land was not sold, but leased. However, the blacks had what the world wanted most: gold, diamonds, ivory, copper, iron ore, and themselves. The trading posts soon became strong fortifications around which villages and towns sprung up as settlers from Asia poured in and armed forces became organized. The Africans watched these developments with increasing apprehension, for the traders were often armed with superior and different types of weapons of war, and spent much time in training recruits, including Africans. Indeed, in some areas a definite pattern emerged: an all-African army under Asian officers, a pattern to be followed later by Europeans. This was easy enough for the Arabs. They owned the captured Africans who made up their fighting forces. The Africans could blame only themselves for this. Here, as in certain other things, they were still engaged in practices which, while once universal, had long since been dying out or generally abandoned by the rest of the world. This one was the enslavement of captured prisoners of war. When African chiefs and kings began to sell these slave-hungry Arabs, they set in motion a chain of events which was to undermine the civilizations of the most advanced societies on the continent, further checking their progress and degrading their whole race for another 2,000 years. When the sale of their fellows became the chief source of wealth, African leaders became increasingly estranged from the finest thing in African life, the sense of community and kinship with all who would be friends. When greed severed the traditional ties of brotherhood, gradual movement of the invaders from the coastal areas inland became relatively easy. Blacks against blacks with increasing suspicion and hatred may be traced to the Africans' own slave raids. The inland raids for slaves were resisted by some chiefs and the raiders were attacked. But this opposition was not always due to any opposition to slavery, but to this kind of direct action, which passed by the chiefs and thereby eliminated their profits. The conquest of the blacks by religion. Other invaders found penetration easy under the banners of religion. Full advantage was taken of the fact that Africans are a very religious people. First came the crescent flag of the Prophet. The Islamic advance was three-pronged. Proselytizing missions became one brotherhood. Widespread intermarriages and concubinage with African women due to Muslim system of polygamy, and forceful conversions at sword point. The cross of Jesus Christ followed the Muslim crescent. The cloak of Christianity was a most convenient hiding place for those who had other designs, hence the drive to convert. Conversion here meant far more than conversion to Christianity. As in the case of Islam, it meant change into the white man's image, his ideas and value system. The real object of worship turned out to be neither Jesus Christ nor his Father God, but Western man and Western civilization. Christian Brotherhood? Well, yes, in principle. Or, to be practical, you blacks can have all the Christian Brotherhood you desire among yourselves. Apartheid was African-wide under colonialism, and not a peculiarity of the South African system as so many are led to think. But what happened in the process of converting the blacks to Islam and Christianity was the supreme triumph of the white world over the black. Millions of Africans became non-Africans. Africans who were neither Muslims nor Christians were classed as pagans and therefore required to disavow their whole culture and to regard practically all African institutions as backward or savage. The blacks in their own right became non-persons, members of a race of nobodies, and so hopeless that self-realization as personalities, even in a subordinate status, could only be achieved by becoming Muslims or Christians. Indeed, in order to destroy completely not only their African heritage, but also their very African identity psychologically, they were forced to change their names to Arabic and Christian names. Henceforth, if these black Emils, Johns, Muhammads, Samuels, and Abdullahs happened to achieve greatness in some field, the assumption would be that it was Caucasian achievement, unless a special effort was made to identify the race of the persons in question. Blacks at home in Africa and blacks scattered all over the world bore the names of their enslavers and oppressors, the ultimate in self-effacement that promoted a self-hatred which made pride in race difficult. That these psychological shackles still handicap not only the rebirth of modern African states, but also blacks everywhere, it should be obvious to all. Finally, there were the invaders who apparently disdained the cloak of deception and came in fighting. They had no problems. They knew in advance that they would find the Africans almost everywhere unprepared to defend themselves against a well-organized, well-trained body of men, no matter how small. This situation developed as splinter, independent little states became more and more numerous. The use of secret agents seems to be as old as organized states, for the practice of sending spies as goodwill ambassadors, traders, etc., well in advance into a country to be invaded, goes far back into antiquity. Those sent into Africa from various lands could report back that 1. The Africans were largely a peaceful people engaged in agriculture, mining trade, fishing, the arts, crafts of various kinds, and manufacturing such things as pottery, furniture, building materials, boats, weapons of war, etc. 3. But that they are ill prepared for war, except against their neighbors, who also use the kind of spears, bows, and arrows which we abandoned long since. 4. In general, they have no swiftly moving mounted soldiers. 100 of our dashing cavalrymen with firepower could put 10,000 of them to flight. 5. They are a secretive people, for while they are fully aware of the great mineral wealth of the continent, they use it in a very limited way, mainly for personal adornment, and have no desire to open up to foreigners for world commerce that would greatly benefit them. They accordingly rigidly limit their trading activities, but mainly because Asians hold all of their seacoasts and have cut them off from the world and its trade. 6. Finally, the whole of Africa could, with a few exceptions, be progressively taken over simply by picking off one small state after another. For the overall pattern of the continent is one of countless small independent groups, each for itself and itself alone. There is no unity among them, even for a common defense. Since it is the first duty of each chief to protect his people, all seem to be too proud to seek unity with other chiefs, thinking this might indicate a sign of weakness and itself invite attack. Therefore, it could have been truthfully reported to either Asia or Europe any time during the last 1,000 years that the widespread segmentation and attending disunity among the Africans made them easy to conquer and dominate. Some of these 6 hypothetical items would be valid as conclusions regarding a general situation only after the widespread collapse of strong African states, when small splinter states spread over the continent like an epidemic. But, as we shall see, the united resistance of the blacks to white Asian invasions had been going on before recorded history began, and, despite all the segmentations and endless invasions from the north, south, east, and west, there were black nations that kept up the resistance of 5,000 years, right down into the 20th century. We shall review some of these in chapters which follow.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.